Hey everyone, in this tutorial we're going to take a look at building a NativeScript application using Angular 2. So as of May 2016, Telerik, which is now Progress, announced that you can use Angular 2 inside of your NativeScript application to develop Android and iOS apps. So this would actually be NativeScript 2.0. And we're actually going to take a look at just building a simple application that makes use of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our terminal. If you're on a Windows computer, it's going to be a command prompt. But we're going to build a new project. So from the terminal, go ahead and type in the following. And this is of course assuming that you already have NativeScript installed. So we're going to type in TNS create Angular project, and then we're going to use the --ng tag. Perfect. So this actually created it in my home directory, so let me move that onto my desktop so that way we know where we're working with it. So let's go ahead and do move, what do we call it, Angular project, and let's move it to the desktop. So I just moved it to my desktop, and I will open it. So before we start looking at code though, let's go ahead and add our platforms to our project so that way we can know what we're building for. So we can go ahead and first navigate into that project. So it's on my desktop and then Angular project. We're going to type in TNS platform add Android. All right. With Android added as a platform, now we can add, if we're on a Mac, this is only for Mac users, we're going to say TNS platform add iOS. So just like any mobile development, you have to have a Mac in order to build for iOS. Perfect. So we now have our project and we have our platforms added. The next thing we want to do is, because we're left with just a very vanilla project, and this app is actually going to be a two-page application, so it's going to have two different screens. We need to create some files and directories that don't already exist. So if we look at the root of our project, we're going to navigate into app, and we're going to go ahead and create everything inside of our app directory. And I'm going to do that from my terminal. So I'm going to say make directory. So and I'm going to say app/components. And I'm going to say make directory app/components/create. And then app/components list. So we're going to have a create page and we're going to have a list page. Now we can create some files in each one of those directories. So we can say touch app components/create.component.ts, because we're going to be working with TypeScript inside of that same components directory. And I've already made a mistake, but we'll go ahead and correct that in a second. We're going to create an XML file for the components.ts file. And you can see because I had intended to put the create component inside of the create directory. So I'll just drag that in. So we have everything that's necessary for the create screen. Now we need to worry about the list screen. So we can say touch app components/list/list.component.ts. And we can do the same thing for an XML file. And this is just good naming conventions. This isn't mandatory. You can name them whatever you want. All right. So we have all of the necessary files created. So let's go ahead and open that project. You can see that I am using Atom by GitHub. I will zoom in. So I did zoom in. So what we're going to do now is we're going to worry about creating the list component first. So let's go ahead and find it. So app, components, list, and then list component. And you can see at the moment it's blank. So what we're going to do is we're going to cheat a little bit. We're going to open up app.components, which exists in your app directory, and we're going to copy everything. And we're actually going to paste it inside of list component.ts. And this actually saves us a little bit of time. So we're going to delete everything inside of app component and we're going to rename it. We're going to rename it list component. And then we can go ahead and change the selector. Let's call it list, something simple, because this is going to be our list component. what we can do now is we can copy this layout right here. So I'm going to actually cut it instead. And I'm going to paste it in list.xml. And we're going to do a lot of revisions coming up in just a moment. But for now, that's fine. So with that cut, we need to make some changes here. So what we want to say is we want to reference that XML file. So we're going to do ./components/list/list.xml. And instead of template, it's now template URL. And we're going to save that. So far, so good. The next thing we want to do is we want to add a few more AngularJS or Angular 2 components, so dependencies. So we're going to say import location from Angular/common. So the location, what it actually is it's it allows you to subscribe to pop events. So if we navigate backwards in our navigation stack, so if someone hits the back button, the location will trigger. All right, the next thing that we're going to import is we're going to import the router. So import router from Angular/router deprecated. So you might be alarmed that, hey, this is a deprecated router. It's deprecated because as of right now, the new router is still work in progress by the Angular team. So this is still a very valid option. NativeScript will actually upgrade this when it's necessary. So for now, this is fine. So we're going to go ahead and save this. Finally, we're going to add a NativeScript specific component here. So we're going to say import asterisk as application settings from application -settings. And this, if you're familiar with local storage for HTML5 and JavaScript, this is pretty similar. So since we don't have access to the web browser, so we can't use local storage, we're going to use this instead. And you'll see how similar this is. And this is how we're actually going to save our data. So go ahead and save it. Now if you drop down into the list component, what we want to do is we want to create our variables. So first of all, we want to create a private variable. We'll go ahead and call that router, and it's going to be a router variable. The second variable we wanted to create is a public variable. So we're going to create public person list array object. So the difference between private and public here, public variables can get rendered in the XML file. Private variables, the XML file is not aware of these private variables and cannot make use of them. So that's the difference. So person list is actually going to get rendered in a list view in the XML file. So with those two created, now we can go ahead and create our constructor. Now what we want to say before we go ahead and start initializing our variables is, first of all, we want to inject the router and the location. So we're going to say router, and we're going to say location. Perfect. So now we can say something like this. This.router, because we have a private variable for router, equals router, so the variable that was injected. We can also say this.personList equals, so this time we're actually going to initialize it from the application settings, so the storage. We're going to say json.parse application settings dot get string people, and then the second one is going to be a empty brackets here. So let me explain what's going on here. So we can't store objects inside of application settings. We can only store strings and integers and things like that. So what we're doing is we have this key people. So what we're doing is we're storing serialized objects. So if for some reason we have not saved yet, we're setting a default object, which is this serialized empty array. So when we parse it out, turn it back into an object, it'll just be an empty array of objects. So now what we want to do is we want to say location, and notice how we don't create a private variable for it, so it's not necessary, but we're going to say location subscribe. It does have a path parameter, so we're going to say subscribe, and then inside of there we're going to say we're just going to say the same thing that we've put up here, and I'll explain why we're doing this twice. All right, so we're doing this twice because when we navigate backwards in our application, the constructor does not get called again. The constructor only gets called when we navigate to. It doesn't get called when we navigate back. So instead, we have to use location to subscribe to back events, so pop events. So when this event, when it detects that we've navigated backwards, then we're going to reload from that application settings. So that's why we have it twice. All right, so with the constructor out of the way, we can now create a function. So this function is going to be create, and it's going to be this.router.navigate, and we're going to navigate to create, which we haven't yet created yet, but that's going to be our create page, so our create component. So we now have the logic file to this first page. So now what we want to do is we want to worry about the XML portion, so what gets rendered to the screen. So open up list.xml. We're gonna add an action bar to this, so that way it looks nicer and more pleasing. So we're gonna say action bar. We're gonna give it a title. We're gonna say person list. And now what we want to do is we want to add a button, so an action item. So we're going to say action item text equals create. So as you can predict, this is going to be a create button in our action bar. So when the tap event happens, so when someone taps the button, it's going to say create. So we're going to call that create function that we just made. And for iOS, we're going to position it on the right. Perfect. All right, now that we have our action bar set up, now what we want to do is we want to create our list view. So let's go ahead and get rid of all of the code that we already have. It's not really necessary. I only pasted it there to get it out of the way for now. So what we want to do is we want to create a grid layout, and this will allow us to make use of the list view so that way it takes up the full remaining space of the screen. If we left it as a stack layout, it would just be as large as necessary for however many elements are in the list view. So we don't want that. We want it to take up the full screen. So we're creating a grid layout, and then we're creating a list view. For items, the items of this list view, we're going to say it equals person list. So remember, person list is a public variable inside of our TypeScript file. Let's go ahead and close off list view. And inside of the list view tags, we want to define the template of how it's rendered. So we're going to say template, and we're going to say let equals, you know what, let item, equals item. So for every person list item, it's going to be referred to as item. So you'll see in just a second. All right, so inside of the template, now we can define a label. So this is going to be the static text that we show on the screen. So for text, we're going to say it equals item, and we're going to say it equals first name, and we're going to say space item dot last name. And as far as the list component.ts file goes, we don't really know what's inside of this person list, but let's go ahead and assume that it has a first name property and a last name property. Because remember, it's an array of objects. It's not an array of strings. So we can go ahead and close this off. Perfect. We now have our front end for this first page. So now we can worry about going to the second page. And as you can probably predict, to save us time, I'm actually going to copy the code from list component. And we'll add and remove as necessary. So I just copied list component.ts. I'm going to create and then create component.ts, and I'm pasting it in. First of all, for the selector, I'm calling it create instead of list. For the template URL, I am calling it create again instead of list. And then instead of list component, it's create component. Perfect. We can actually strip out some things. So we are not going to be routing anywhere. So we can remove the router. Instead, we're just going to be navigating backwards. So we don't need the router for that. So let's go ahead and remove all occurrences of it. We also are not, we don't have a create function in this case. I mean, we could call it create. I'm going to call it save instead. But let's remove that as well. What we are going to have is we're going to have a private variable. This time it's going to be location. So in this case, we are going to specify a private location. Inside of the constructor, you can assume yes, we are saying this dot location equals location, so whatever was injected. As far as the constructor goes, we can go ahead and leave this dot person list up there because what we're going to do is we're actually going to, when the user hits save, we're going to save whatever's in the form to this person list and then save person list back into application settings. So we can leave that there. And since we're not navigating backwards, we don't need to subscribe to events. But what we do need is we actually need the form variables that are actually bound to the UI. So these are going to be public, of course. Public first name. It's going to be a string. Public last name, also a string. Person list will never be rendered in this case, so we're actually going to make that private. It's just going to be something that we can access inside of our TypeScript file. We do want to initialize these first name and last name. So we're going to say first name equals empty string, and then last name equals empty string. And then we can go down to our save function. So we're going to say save, and we're actually going to first check to make sure that first name and last name is not empty, because if it's empty, we don't want to save anything. So we're going to say if this dot first name not equals empty string, and this dot last name not equal empty string. As long as those conditions are met, then what we can do is we can say this dot person list dot push. So we're going to push something into that array of objects. So we're going to push, and we're actually going to create a new object here. We're going to say first name, and we're going to say this dot first name, and then we're going to have a last name, and that's going to be this dot last name. And we can put a semicolon at the end. So after we push it to this list, it's not saved, it's added to the list. So we do want to save it now. So we want to say application settings dot set string. We're still going to use the key people, but what we want to do is we want to serialize that array of objects. So we're going to say json.stringify, and then we're going to say this dot person list, and we can save it again. Finally, when this is all said and done, we want to navigate backwards. So we want to close out the form. So we can say this dot location dot back, and that will navigate backwards in the stack. It's not a push event, it's a pop event. So that's why on the previous screen the subscription will trigger. All right, so we can go ahead and save that. Now we can worry about working with our XML front end. So go to create.xml, and we're going to create another action bar. So we're going to say action bar. We're going to give it a title. This time we're going to say create. And you guessed it, we're going to have another action item. This one's going to call the save function that we made. So we're going to say action item text equals save. And then for the tap event, it's going to call a save function. And then for positioning wise, we're going to say ios.position equals right. And we're going to close that off. We are going to make another adjustment though. By default, the naming of your back button for iOS is going to be whatever your view is. So instead of that, I actually want to just call it back. So what we're going to say is we're going to say navigation item. No, not navigation item, navigation button. And then we're going to say text equals back. We're going to say Android.sysIcon because we don't want it to look too weird on Android because Android doesn't really have this kind of button because they usually has a software or hardware back button. We're going to say IC menu back. And we're actually going to say we're going to close this off. Perfect. So we have our action bar. Now what we want to do is we want to make our layout. On the previous screen we used a grid layout. That's not necessary for this screen. We just want to use as much space as necessary. It's not like a list. It would look pretty weird if it was a list. So we're going to use a stack layout. That's a pretty common layout. All right, so inside of the stack layout, we're going to have two forms. So we're going to have a text field. We're going to have a hint. The hint is actually going to be first name. And we're going to bind it. So we're going to use ng model. So if you're familiar with Angular 1, it performs the same way. So anything inside of ng model will be bound to a particular variable inside of your TypeScript file. So we're actually going to bind, of course, this first name text field with the public first name variable. And we're going to close this off. I'm going to duplicate that row to save me some typing. I'm going to call this last name, and I'm going to change the ng model to last name. So this is all of our form fields now. So we're not done yet. We can't necessarily run this yet. So what we want to do is we want to navigate into app.component.ts. And we need to make some changes here. So this app component is actually going to be in charge of kind of being the parent router to all of our pages. So it's going to be the controller to all of our pages. So first off, let's get rid of some of this stack layout. What we're going to have is very simple here. We're actually going to have page router outlet, and then close that off. We're actually we can leave my app. We do need to include a few things. So we're going to say import, and we're going to import route config. And we're doing that from Angular router deprecated again. We also need to import some services here, some providers and directives. So we can say import ns router directives. So this is NativeScript specific, whereas most of what we've seen so far has been Angular 2 specific. So ns router directives, and then ns router providers from, and we're going to say NativeScript Angular /router. Perfect. We actually do need to include those directives and providers inside of our at component. So we're going to say directives ns router directives, and then for providers we're going to say providers, and of course you guessed it, ns router providers. Put a comma after that too. Perfect. Now what we want to do is we want to wipe out this code that's inside of app component. We do want to leave app component there, but we're not going to be doing any kind of initialization logic when the application loads, but we could if we wanted to. What we do want to do is we want to set up the actual page routes, but before we can do that we have to include them. So we're going to say import list component from put a slash there, components /list/list. So we're also going to say import create component from component /create/create. And you can see that I have two errors here on 5 and 6. That's because I didn't name them correctly. So it should be list component and create component. Perfect. So the error went away inside of my Atom editor. All right, one more thing to do in this particular file. We actually have to configure those routes now that we've included them, or configure those components. So after component, we can say route config. And inside of route config, it's actually not an object because we have several of them. So it's going to be, we're going to say inside of our first object here, we're going to say path. It's going to be list. The component is going to be list component. The name is going to be list. And list is actually going to be the default screen. So we're going to say use as default. True. All right. So that's the first route. The second route, we're going to say path create component create component name is going to be create, and these actually both have to be capitalized for the names. Names have to be capitalized here. All right. So there's actually we don't have to add anything else to the create. So at this point it's done. So remember, so for create, this is the same name that we used in the list component for our navigation. So they do match. There is one more thing that we have to do here before we can actually see our application in action. And this is actually because we're using the action bar. We have to do a special setting for iOS. That special setting is inside of the app directory and then the main.ts file. What we want to do is we want to say inside of our bootstrap, we're going to do comma null. So we're not passing in any providers or directives or shared services, I mean. And then we're actually going to do our options here. So we're going to do start page action bar hidden. So it already recognizes it because that's the beauty of Atom. And we're going to say false. And then we're saving. So this is an iOS specific thing. But we should be good to go now. All right, with that added, let's go ahead and go back to our terminal. We're not going to build it for iOS. We're going to build it for Android because I figured this is probably something that can talk to people on more levels, since not everyone might have a Mac because Linux and Windows and Mac will all build for Android. So what we want to do is we want to say TNS build Android. And it's all right if we receive these warnings. It doesn't actually cause any kind of problems with our build process. So that's all right. So while it's building, let's go ahead and open up our Android simulator. You can see it already finished before I had a chance. I'll go ahead and open up just any Android simulator should work. I'm going to use Genymotion. Bring that down to scale. Shouldn't take too long to boot the simulator here. All right, with the simulator booted, let's go ahead and run TNS run Android. And we could have done this from the start because it'll actually build and run it at the same time. So it'll just go through it one more time real quick. All right, so it just loaded up our application. So I'm going to go ahead and walk through what we just did. So we created this list screen with an action bar. Right now it doesn't have anything in it. So I'm going to click create. You can see that this is centered. I forgot to show you that there are some stylings already in place that we didn't remove. But I'll go ahead and add an item and I'll click save. So it added me to the list. So let's say I want to add another one. you can see that it's continuously adding these items to the list. And if I back out of it and I try to open this project again, the data will still exist. And when it comes to styling, you can see that if I open up app.css, I have a bunch of items already in here. One being this horizontal align, because we are a label, so not a label. It'll horizontally align it to center. So if I strip all this stuff out and build it again, it'll align it to the left. So you just saw how to build a NativeScript app using Angular 2. There wasn't a whole lot to it. Most of the code that we wrote was in fact Angular 2 code. There was very minimal amounts of NativeScript code involved in this.